to just, drag this out is irresponsible at a point when there is an urgent need for a real prosecutor to be moving things forward. I remain befuddled why Putin has not been charged for any of the bombing. Duterte shows the naivete of leaders thinking that they can get away with mass atrocities by just clinging to power forever.
Hi, good day again, friends. This is Conde for another episode of Open Talk. Today, I'm very, very honored and happy to have somebody I admire guest on the show. He is Ken Roth, the former executive director of Human Rights Watch, and who used to be my boss. In 2022, he left Human Rights Watch after serving it for more than 30 years. Since then, he's been teaching at Princeton, and in February, he launched a book called Righting Wrongs. And in it, Ken Roth detailed the 3 decades that he was working with Human Rights Watch, documenting human rights abuses around the world, including the Philippines. So grab a copy of that book. It's out now. It's published by Knopf. It should be an interesting read about how the human rights movement, figures in the world right now. This conversation that I had with him is divided into 3 parts. One is about the book. We addressed issues such as, is naming and shaming still relevant in the human rights movement? Do tyrants and tough leaders respond to naming and shaming? And what other things can advocates do? The second part of the interview is about the ICC. It was prompted by an op-ed that he published in Foreign Policy magazine, where he argued that the ICC should resolve the issues surrounding Prosecutor Karim Khan, who is right now on leave because of sexual misconduct allegations. Ken thinks that what's going on around the world in terms of human rights violations and atrocities that fall under the mandate of the ICC are significant enough to warrant the appointment either of a new prosecutor or to resolve the case against Mr. Khan. The third part of the interview is about the Philippines, Duterte, and the case in the ICC. Ken thinks that the Duterte case is very, very instructive to the world. You should watch the full interview to know what he actually means by that. But before you do, please consider subscribing to Open Talk, this new podcast, by hitting the subscribe button down below. I really appreciate the follow and the support. Thank you so much, and here's the episode with Ken Roth. Today, I'm so happy and proud to be joined by Ken Roth, the former executive director of Human Rights Watch. Just a little disclosure here: he used to be my boss. He left HRW in 2022, but when I worked there for 14 years, much of it obviously he was the top man. Ken, thank you for joining us today.
Carlos, it's a pleasure to be with you. Great to see you again.
What have you been up to since leaving HRW?
Well, the first thing I did is I wrote a book.
Oh, yeah.
And I devoted a good part of the first year to that. And so that book came out this past February. It's called Righting Wrongs, 3 Decades on the Front Lines Battling Abusive Governments. And so one can get it, on Amazon or whatever. But I've been, that was a big thing. And it really explains, how we put pressure on governments. It outlines the tools we used to try to force governments to behave better. And it's filled with examples. It sort of is, part memoir, part a history of Human Rights Watch, but it's really a strategy lesson for people to understand, how information can be deployed to force governments to behave better. Since then, I've been teaching as a professor at Princeton University, and I've still been writing a lot in The Guardian and other places. And so I've kept pretty busy.
I look forward to having a copy of the book and devour it. The human rights movement globally, as you know, faces a lot of challenges and questions about its methods and all of that. So people might be really interested to know what Human Rights Watch under you had done
in fact, what I show is that, it doesn't always work, but it works a lot. And that's what people don't understand, how it really is possible to exert pressure successfully on governments. And so that's what I wanted to sort of illustrate with the book.
In the conversation online about human rights, sometimes people you get the sense that people think that human rights, you're just magically going to end the world's troubles.
Yeah. I mean, you and I both know that's not true, you know, but it's also, it's not like we just sit around and, sing Kumbaya and hold hands. We were, engaged in a hardball endeavor. We figured out what are the points of leverage, what are governments sensitive about, and we pushed on those points. And we tried to deprive them of things that they wanted, whether it was a good reputation or access to, military aid or economic benefits or diplomatic invitations, whatever they wanted. We tried to prevent them from getting it until they improved their human rights practices. And so the work that we did, first collecting the information on the ground, doing these detailed investigations, and then deploying that information in places where it mattered, forced governments time and time again to change. And that message comes through loud and clear because the book is just filled with examples where that worked. And it doesn't always work immediately. It doesn't always work definitively. Things can get better and worse, but it works enough at the time that it's very worthwhile.
Yeah. Since we're on this, I might as well ask you this question because obviously what Human Rights Watch does and other groups as well, such as Amnesty and the many international organizations, it's not just naming and shaming. But there seems to be some discussion lately, I mean, at least in my sphere, that probably naming and shaming doesn't work as much as it used to. Any thought on that one?
Well, I mean, in the book, I address this, and clearly there are certain kinds of abuses that are popular. Particularly if you get autocratic leaders that try to, demonize immigrants or demonize LGBT people, things like that are often, popular human rights abuses. But I describe how you get around that. And one thing is that even though these abuses may be popular with an autocrat space, they often are not popular in cities, which tend to be, more cosmopolitan, more rights oriented. They also are not popular with other governments that have influence. So, for example, I talk about how we were able to force Viktor Orban's government in Hungary to behave better, even though his abuses were popular in Hungary, but they were not popular in Brussels, in the European Union. And he depended on these billions of euros in aid from Brussels, which they then conditioned on an improvement in his human rights practices. So there are always ways around even these, some areas where shaming is more limited.
Yeah, in the case of the Philippines, which we will talk about in more detail later, the pushback against the human rights movement in the Philippines is that this is all a Western construct being imposed in a third world country like the Philippines, and that people like Duterte should be celebrated and supported. I mean, obviously, that plays into the hands of, tyrants like him, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, look, and I think, Carlos, you know this very well. That's a convenient argument for an autocrat to make. But, nobody wanted their sons summarily executed in a drug raid. And the people who were being killed were just, poor young men who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time and were summarily shot.
Hmm.
Nobody wants to be brought into prison and tortured. Nobody, going back to the Marcos dictatorship, nobody wants to be imprisoned for their political views. And at the same time, everybody wants healthcare and education and decent housing. These are broadly desired rights. Nobody wants unfair trials. So the idea that these are Western impositions, no, these are what people around the world want. And the people who are imposing are the autocrats, the dictators who are imposing their power at the expense of people's rights.
In some countries, again, like the Philippines, there seems to be this notion that your rights, your civil liberties, can be sacrificed for comforts like a better functioning city or a better governed country. I mean, in the Philippines, which is a very, very divided country and very, very poor. We often see that where people say, okay, I mean, better to have somebody like Duterte or a milder version of him like, I don't know, Lee Kuan Yew to have our traffic flowing smoothly, to have a better internet, to have better utilities and all of that. I mean, this resonates to a lot of people, particularly poor people.
No, I mean, everybody who makes that argument cites Lee Kuan Yew. And he's sort of the exception that proves the rule. I mean, this, happened to be an autocratic prime minister in Singapore who was not terribly corrupt and who, governed in an enlightened way and improved life in Singapore overall, even though he suppressed basic rights and liberties. But the reason human rights are important is to hold a government accountable, among other things. If you can't speak out, if you don't have free media, if you don't have independent political parties, if you don't have civil society, then the ruler operates for his benefit, for his cronies' benefit, and they tend to be self-serving. They fill their bank accounts. They're corrupt. And we've seen this in country after country. When you have autocrats who suppress civil liberties, you don't get a better, train system or better traffic flow. You get, Maduro in Venezuela, where, 6 million people have fled economic disaster in what was an oil-rich country before that. Or you get, people like, Mugabe or people, these African tyrants who have absolutely destroyed their countries. So if you were just sort of imagining yourself moving to some unidentified country, and you had to say, do I want to go to a country where the people are free to express their views about government policy, or do I want an autocrat? You'd be out of your mind to want an autocrat because, 9 out of 10 times the autocrat serves themselves and the people are impoverished and suffer greatly. So I think this, idea you need an autocrat to get things running is the argument that autocrats make, but is not reality.
And you can add to the list of these autocrats, Duterte, where, from 2016 up to the time he left office in 2022, there have been, exposés about massive corruption during his term. And even today, the Philippines is being roiled by these corruption scandals on flood control and public works projects, billions and billions of pesos being lost, because the government agencies are in cahoots with private contractors. And this was enabled during Duterte's time, and apparently also even during Marcos's time, the present president, and some even say even before. Okay, you published an op-ed in Foreign Policy about the International Criminal Court. In that op-ed, you argued that the Assembly of States Parties, this is kind of the governing body of the ICC, should act on the question about the chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, who is on leave for allegations of sexual misconduct. What's the rationale for this? Can you walk us through a bit about the arguments?
Sure. Well, let me first just take a step backwards and explain where we are. So the Assembly of States Parties, as you mentioned, these are the member states of the ICC, 125 members. They are the ones who hire or fire the chief prosecutor. Now, Karim Khan is that prosecutor. And since May, he has taken a voluntary leave of absence because of allegations against him regarding an alleged sexual assault on a staff member. Now, I should say I have no direct knowledge as to whether this accusation is true or not. So I'm agnostic on that. But what I want is for the issue to be resolved one way or the other. Because what we have right now is the prosecutor's office essentially headless at a time when there are very important decisions to be made. There have been 2 deputies who are assigned to run things in his absence, but the deputies don't have his stature. And so the kinds of decisions that are awaiting a permanent prosecutor are things like, should anybody be charged for Israel's bombing in Gaza? So far, Netanyahu and Gallant have been charged for starving Palestinian civilians, but nobody's been charged for the bombing. There were rumors that the prosecutor was considering charges against 2 of the far-right Israeli ministers for expanding the settlements in the occupied West Bank. That has gone nowhere, as far as we can tell. Putin has been charged for kidnapping Ukrainian children, but not for any bombing of Ukrainian civilians or civilian infrastructure. Why is that? And there are a series of very important decisions like this. Even the decision, should Trump be charged with obstruction of justice because he imposed sanctions on Khan, his 2 deputies, and 6 judges, in part because they approved the Israeli charges, charges against Netanyahu and Gallant, in part because they approved an old investigation in Afghanistan that theoretically could have implicated the Bush-era torturers in Afghanistan. So these are big decisions. They're not the kind of decisions that I think 2 deputies are likely to take. And so we need a chief prosecutor who's fully empowered. And either that's Khan, if he's cleared of these accusations and he returns to his office, or if he is actually, guilty as charged, and he should step down, the Assembly and States parties need to do that and move forward. But to just, drag this out is irresponsible at a point when there is an urgent need for a real prosecutor to be moving things forward.
Can the Assembly of States parties, can they actually, I mean, fire him just because of these allegations? Or
They,
obviously there needs to be some due process, right? But given what you outlined.
they have the power to remove the chief prosecutor by a majority vote. So they
Mhm,
have the power to do that. There needs to be a fair process, of course. So Khan has contested this accusation, as is his right. There has been an investigator looking into it. At some point, some subset of the Assembly of States parties have got to hear the charges, consider the evidence pro and con, and make a decision. And then the full assembly needs to vote. But this is, too important to drag on as long as it has. I think we have to allow the process to proceed. And as I say, I have no direct knowledge one way or the other as to the validity of these accusations. Was this a consensual relationship? Was there a relationship? Was there coercion involved? I don't know.
yeah.
But this just has to be resolved, and it's too important to drag on.
Yeah, as you pointed out in your op-ed, cases, and you also, of course, explained earlier, some cases have stalled, are not acted on. My question is, how much discretion does a single prosecutor actually have on these cases to move things along? I mean, you have two acting, I would say, you have two prosecutors in charge. How problematic can that be? Why not just go with this for the meantime?
Well, I mean, first of all, the prosecutor's discretion is limited in that in cases that they are initiating on their own, they need approval of a so-called pretrial chamber. So three judges have to approve the issuance of an arrest warrant. So they don't act entirely on their own. They are dependent on credible facts presented to a panel of judges. And that's as it should be.
Hmm.
But, will the two deputies have the stature, the willingness, the sense of leadership to bring forward some of these more difficult cases? Um, I don't know. I don't know these two
Yeah.
individuals, but I'm skeptical because Khan, for whatever faults he has, was a man of self-confidence and stature and courage, and was able to move forward with tough cases, more so than his two predecessors. So I give him credit,
Yeah.
but if he needs to step down, we need to resolve this.
Yeah. Finally, on this point, Ken, what qualities should the Assembly of States parties consider in choosing the next prosecutor if ever Khan is removed or is found guilty or stops working for the ICC? And does the ICC structure in terms of choosing a prosecutor need to be reformed to prevent future paralysis such as this?
Well, I mean, this is always a political process. And, whoever emerges as one of the leading candidates has to, build a majority among the state's parties. So there's no getting past that. If I can advise the states, it would be to look for somebody who is genuinely independent and who is guided by facts and law. That's the key. And particularly on issues like Israel, where, excuse me, where, many people have strong views one way or the other. You need somebody who says, I'm going to look at the facts, and whatever the facts compel, that's what I'm going to charge. I'm not going to allow myself to be, bullied by Trump imposing sanctions or, by this or that country objecting. I'm going to be a straight shooter and call it as the facts dictate. And, Khan, to his credit, seemed to be like that. He also, I think in contrast with, say, the first ICC prosecutor, Luis Moreno Ocampo, who tended to charge on the basis of, kind of just enough to get an arrest warrant, but not necessarily enough to win a trial. Khan had the view, which is, I think, is completely correct. And I say this as a former prosecutor myself. You want to have enough evidence to win a trial before you charge. That's, I think, the correct way to proceed because these are going to be contested cases. You don't want to be surprised. You want to make sure you've got, all your ducks in a row. So Khan, I think, was appropriately conservative in that sense, but he also was, aggressive. He was willing to push forward difficult cases. But there are, I mean, I just, I remain befuddled why Putin has not been charged for any of the bombing. He so clearly has command responsibility over whatever happens in Ukraine. What is the reticence there?
Yeah.
And I think it's in that context that it highlights the need to resolve this issue and have a real prosecutor in charge.
Pivoting now to the Philippines, Ken, if I may.
Sure.
Just the fact that Duterte has been hauled to The Hague is remarkable. I mean, not just from a human rights standpoint. This is remarkable for the ICC, obviously, but in the scheme of things, the stuff that we've discussed here so far, how significant this arrest of Duterte and his impending trial do you think, for the court's credibility? Especially given the long-standing criticism, and I'm sure you've heard this, that the ICC only has this inordinate focus on, African nations or leaders.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the argument that, the ICC focused only on sub-Saharan Africa is kind of old now. It's way past that. And so if you look at the work it's done recently in Ukraine, in Gaza, in Afghanistan, in Myanmar, now the Philippines, it's now active around the world. So that's no longer a valid charge. I think, one fair criticism is that so far the ICC has only convicted warlords, militia leaders. It has never convicted a government official. And so that's, you know, the fact that now there is a former president in the dock leaves open the possibility of convicting a very senior government official. So that would be, groundbreaking. But I have to say, the way I've been talking about the Duterte case, because I'm asked about this a lot, is that Duterte shows the naivete of leaders thinking that they can get away with mass atrocities by just clinging to power forever. And we've seen, past illustrations of this going awry because it was very difficult to be president or prime minister for life. And so, Charles Taylor in Liberia thought he was, free to commit war crimes next door in Sierra Leone, but he was toppled. He fled to Nigeria. His protector in Nigeria was forced to surrender him. And he's now serving a 50-year prison term in Britain after conviction by an international tribunal. Or, former Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic, oversaw a genocide next door in Bosnia, thought he was home free. He was president of Serbia, but he tried to steal an election. There was a popular uprising. A new government took over. And to get sanctions lifted, they sent him to The Hague. And, Duterte, I think, was somewhat similar. He thought he could secure his impunity by arranging for his daughter to be vice president. And what he obviously didn't count on is that his daughter, didn't get on well enough with the president, Marcos, over time. And so that, deal for impunity fell apart.
Yeah.
And this, I think, is an important lesson for the Putins and the Netanyahus of the world, because the two of them undoubtedly think that they can guarantee impunity by just staying in power. But we know that Netanyahu's grip on power already is tenuous. It's not hard to imagine a new government coming in, wanting to end Israel's pariah status and surrendering Netanyahu to The Hague. It's maybe a little harder to imagine that with Putin, but there's many parts of Russia where he's not popular. Where people see the utter disaster he's led the nation into by his unilateral decision to invade Ukraine. So I actually think this step with Duterte is not only positive for the ICC, but it's also positive for the cause of justice to show that, a leader, no matter how powerful they feel, there comes a time when they may have lost enough power that they cannot guarantee their impunity for mass atrocities.
Could Duterte's case be a rallying point for to push for the ICC to make reforms,
Well,
or
I mean,
it's
I
too
think the
small a
ICC,
case?
yeah, no, the ICC is much more energized under Khan than it had been under his predecessors. I mean, the first prosecutor, Luis Moreno Ocampo, issued a lot of charges but didn't get a lot done. Fatou Bensouda, the second prosecutor, opened a bunch of new investigations, but also didn't bring that many new charges. And it took Khan to actually bring cases forward. So he's been a doer. I don't think people can say the court has been inactive. It's a little slower than I'd like it to be, but it's working. But it's been, largely paralyzed since Khan took leave in May. And that's what I'm trying to end with this article in Foreign Policy.
Yeah. Finally, Ken, there's a push for the Philippines to get back to the ICC by re-ratifying the Rome statutes.
I mean, I would hope that Marcos would do that. In other words, he obviously recognized the court enough to surrender Duterte. It was Duterte who withdrew, but you can't withdraw retroactively. So the court had jurisdiction over his crimes. But, in a sense, it's important for a government, even if it sees itself as a law-abiding government, to join the ICC as an insurance policy against the future, because you never know who might come into office, who might be tempted to commit atrocities. And if the ICC has jurisdiction, that's a way of trying to deter this swing to violence and severe human rights abuse. So, I would hope that the same impetus that led the president to surrender Duterte would also lead him to rejoin the ICC.
That would be awesome if that were to happen. Thank you so much, Ken Roth, for joining our program today. Ken Roth, former executive director of Human Rights Watch. Thank you so much, Ken.
Thank you, Carlos. Pleasure to chat with you.